Right now, it's Six Music's artist collection. Blur.
Hello, Stuart.
Hello, Stuart.
Hello, Stuart.
Hello, Stuart.
Hello, Blur.
The first moment I thought we had something was when we rehearsed in my garage in Colchester. That's when we did sing, because we had that piano. And it just sounded right, didn't it? Yeah. And then we played in the Railway Museum.
Yeah.
And I ended up in one of the fields with a beautiful girl. So I'd done a gig, and then I was in a field of corn, and I thought, this is the life for me. It was romance, music, in one way or another. That's still what I live for.
It's kind of really like your mum getting out an old photograph album, isn't it? Showing it to your girlfriend.
Frankly, it doesn't sort of go back that far to sort of nappies. But almost. I mean, we started quite young.
With his hands on the road.
They become very popular, successful records because they encapsulate all of those different periods, and even Noel Gallagher once quoted that he'd buy a Blur greatest hits.
Sports on the TV, everybody's at it.
It's going to take 10 years, Alice, before people have forgotten what you got up to.
I'm rebranding.
Listen, for once and for once only, Parklife was not a quintessentially British record. It was a record that was taking quite a satirical and angry look at quintessentially British culture and the way that it was becoming Americanised.
Whatever Britpop is, it's kind of far enough in the past now for everyone to be slightly nostalgic about it. And suddenly everyone wants to claim it to be their own.
Well, I think we're
still trying to distance ourselves from it. I have absolutely no idea what it means, how we're supposed to be a part of it.
All those dirty words, they make us look so dumb. And into the sea goes pretty London me round the Bay of Biscay.
It has, to this day, probably got one of my best lyrics ever, even if I did nick it off the handkerchief. The shipping forecast is something I've listened to since a child, and you know, when I was younger, you always used to send me to sleep, so I've travelled around that metaphoric route.
This is a low and a whole series of highs. The story of Blur is a story of the profoundest lows and the most dizzying highs. A roller coaster ride through a decade and a half of pop history. White-knuckle thrills, fashion, booze, politics, space travel, bitter rivalries, emotional trauma, and the best pop music of their generation. The story begins in England's oldest inhabited town, Colchester, Essex, where Damon Albarn and Graham Coxon, after a period of mutual suspicion regarding the coolness of each other's shoes, became fast friends with a shared love of the jam and two-tone, and began to make music together in Nigel Hildreth's classes at Stanway School.
Mr. Hildreth encouraged me to write music, and Graham did as well. We had sort of small competitions that we wrote pieces for orchestras, and actually yours was absolutely insane, wasn't it?
I had no idea really about chords, so they'd end up sounding pretty discordant and mad. Yeah.
But mine was very sort of pedestrian and conservative. I think at that age it's just the actual process of doing it that's most important.
Damon was very much a dreamer. He would drift off and he would be using his ideas very much for his own sort of motivation. It was difficult sometimes to get him to concentrate on the task in hand, is really what I'm saying. Graham, again, was a lot quieter than Damon and would work on his own quite effectively. But I think, again, he was very sort of lacking in confidence about his own talents. Whereas I think Damon needed outside discipline sometimes. I shouted at Damon so many times. And he came up to me after he left and he said, "Thank you for shouting at me." And I thought, wow, it could have really put him off the whole idea of performing, of doing things. But he was often miles away when he was supposed to be doing a task. When he was performing a piece, he would suddenly start doodling within the piece rather than actually performing it.
I was too frustrating for him because I'm not very good rhythmically and I just didn't concentrate enough. But I mean, as far as my composition was concerned, he was the one who really got me on the road.
The biggest opportunity that we gave them there at school was through the shows that we put on, the operas. Both Damon and Graham took lead parts in those shows. For example, Damon was Jupiter, King of the Gods, in Orpheus in the Underworld by Offenbach. With Graham as Styx, who was a commander of the Hades. In addition to that, Damon had a lead role in Guys and Dolls.
Love is a thing that has licked them.
With Nathan Detroit.
And it looks like Nathan's just another victim.
When it came to doing a school production, it was a really good thing to be involved in. And if you were slightly geeky and quirky like I was, it was the best way to pull birds. I couldn't do it on the football ground.
Call it sad, call it funny, but it's better than even money that the guy's only doing it for some dough.
That love of performing, I think, was there. You could see it in Damon, particularly, right from the word go. And he was very much the sort of person who relished the audience.
Call it dumb, call it clever, but you can give odds forever that the guy's only doing it for some dough.
There was a piano in the house that my dad taught me the family song on, which is Blue Moon, but he taught me it wrong, so... So I had that arm with that to impress the ladies. I decided to get a keyboard, but they were too expensive, so for my 16th birthday I got a bass guitar from Southbourne Exchange and Mart in Boscombe. Had to wait till Christmas for the amplifier. I had a plectrum and that came in handy.
Strangest feeling to know there are a billion people just like you, feeling like you in their own way. They're just as mixed up as you.
I come from Colchester, which is a big military town, and I really liked the pipe and drum bands. I actually had bagpipe lessons for about 6 months, and the teacher said, "Well, if you ever manage to blow the bag up, I'll buy you a pint." 6 months later, I still couldn't do it.
And all those things I said about you, take them back, I'll keep my words.
The violin, which was what I was given to learn at school, it's a really hard thing to get a tune out of. Like even orchestras have like 20 violins, you know, one violin on its own is not a very satisfying situation, really. There's a bow, there's a bow, and you know, no frets. It's like probably the hardest instrument to get a tune out of, and the first one that we were offered the opportunity of learning at school. So when the piano arrived, and it was really easy to go plink, 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 and pick out Blue Moon wrong. That was where it all started, really, when the piano arrived. I mean, the good thing about guitar, you can pick out a melody on it, which was fortunate, really, because playing the bass guitar is so easy, really. It requires very little sort of technical expertise. If you can hear what you want to play, there's only one rule with the bass, and that's just one note at a time.
I went to Saturday morning music school, I was in at the deep end, really, because there was only 2 people learning to play drums and percussion, one of whom dropped out, and then the drum teacher died. So there was just me. Anything that needed anything hitting, I was the man.
Damon and Graham, plus computer boffin, itinerant drummer and serious drinker Dave Rowntree, also from hometown Colchester, and Graham's new Goldsmith College chum Alex James from Bournemouth, became Seymour, a madcap art punk happening whose shows often ended in chaos. They came to the notice of Food Records, run by journalist Andy Ross and former Teardrop Explodes keyboardist Dave Bouth.
Andy had the tape brought into the office, as was the way that we worked in those days. Andy would be the first filter of things, and sort of 99% of things were taken out, and that would still leave me with 2 or 3 things a week that Andy would say, hey, this is great, we ought to sign it. And then I'd filter out 99% of what Andy recommended. Anyway, he was sweet on Seymour, as it was at the time, and we used to go and see them. I suppose of all the groups we got involved with, it was probably the longest period between sort of expressing our initial interest and that kind of coming to fruition. They looked at us very much as Andy was the keen one and I was the not keen one, and it's true to an extent, but at the same time I just saw it as we had to get them right. I mean, you're never really sure at that early stage whether something's right or not. But it went really well. We had a really productive dialogue for months that resulted in them developing really well, and then we signed them.
They were called Seymour initially, and you didn't like that name, did you?
No. I mean, funnily enough, I discovered years later that it was based on a short story by, what's his name?
J.D. Salinger. Yeah.
And I loved that story. And as soon as he said that, it gave me a completely different perspective on the name, which made me like it. I probably still would have changed it, because I think most people would have thought, Seymour, why pick a wimpy guy's name?
Yeah.
And we just thought it was a terrible name. And it's very hard to come up with one alternative name. So we said, you make out a list, we'll make out a list of 20 alternative names, and we'll swap them on one day. And Andy and I still argue over who wrote Blur on it. I think I did, and then years later I said, I'm glad they picked my name. And Andy go, what do you mean your name? It's my name. So we can't agree between the 2 of us who came up with it. And they came back and just said, we'd like the name Blur from this list of 20 we'd given them, and then Sue her.
When did you first meet Blur?
1990. In the coffee house in a pub in Soho.
Ex-food publicist Polly Birkbeck.
Andy Ross was telling me about this new band he signed. We went upstairs and then they all were sitting in the corner, 4 really cute blokes. Damon with his Brian Jones bass and cut. And I remember Andy, before I met them, Andy said, they sound a bit like Talking Heads. That's what his description was. And I remember sort of seeing Damon and thinking, very cute. They seemed really young at the time, even though they're only like a couple of years younger than me, but I always remember them as being really young. Damon was quite confident even then anyway.
Blur producer Stephen Street.
The video I saw was for their first single, She's So High, and I was blown away. I just thought, hey, I really like this record. I was really into the sound of it. At the time, my manager was managing Jesus Jones, so I knew that they shared the same label. So I said to my manager, look, just let Food Records know that if they are looking for a producer to work with these guys in the future, I'd be very interested. Which is quite unusual, because normally bands kind of come to me, but in this way I actually approached them through the label. And I got word back that thanks to the interest, but they're going to do the next single with the same production team who did the first single. And so I thought, well, there you go, I missed that opportunity. A few weeks later, I got a call saying, actually, that session didn't work out too well. They're very interested in meeting you. Would you like to meet up? So I went up to the old Brewer Street food offices and met up with the guys, and went downstairs to the pub next door and had a meeting, and decided we'd go in the studio together.
In that first session with Street, Blur recorded 2 tracks, one of which was a number of Damon's of no great regard within the band. There's No Other Way, though, became an anthem of the new baggy movement, led by the Stone Roses and Happy Mondays, and in the spring of 1991, it gave Blur their first top 10 single and even made Dave Balfour happy man.
We really felt we'd achieved quite a lot with She's So High. And then we came up with this thing, and it was a great dance floor track in the time when dance and indie were coming together. It was a great song. In fact, I remember walking into the studio mid-recording and just hearing that organ thing combined with the beat and just knowing it was a hit. I said it was top 10 at that moment, and we knew it was. Sometimes you know.
Taking the fun out of everything. I don't want to think at all. All that you can do is watch them play.
Food at the time were experiencing a lot of success with Jesus Jones. David Balfour in particular at Food wanted to put the same kind of modern dance dynamic behind Blur. I did do it to a certain degree on There's No Other Way, because there was a kind of, dare I say, a baggy loop, as it were, underpinning the whole thing. Balfour was really into everything being pretty sequenced and done to a click and everything. I remember one track he wanted to get remixed, and when he found out there wasn't a click track or a tempo map for it, he was kind of, what, you didn't do it to a click? I said, well, no, actually, this track we just did live.
I mean, I was just going into a meeting, having a bit of an argument about what I thought versus what they thought. It's the oldest trick in the book. Put that year's dance beat on it. It had the baggy beat, and it did it without doing it in a particularly manipulative way.
I was certainly aware that they wanted to put a more modern dance type program drum fill behind Blur, but that really wasn't what Blur were about. And I believe if I had gone in there trying to do that to them, I wouldn't have got as far as I did with them.
One of the reasons I'd run a record label was to have the power, because I was sick of being, as a manager, you tell the artist what you think and they go off and do whatever they think. But when you're the record company guy, you can say, this is what I think, and either we come to some agreement on it or we don't go forward. I definitely underrated how galling and how difficult that was for them. Admittedly, I argued very strongly, but it didn't seem to me quite as nasty as having read what they've said.
There's no other way. All that you can do is watch them play.
We did that session together, the early session, and I had to go off and do an album, so I was away for 2.5 months. When I got back and heard There's No Other Way on the radio, and it suddenly went ballistic, Food very quickly booked some more studio time and got me back in the studio with them. In the interim period, they had done some recordings with Mike Thorne, which went on the first album, and I went back in the studio and did some more tracks for the Leisure album. I was fairly happy with it, but I don't think particularly Food were as a label. They kind of felt they wanted it to be more kind of sequenced, I feel.
He's a 20th century boy with his hands on the rails, trying not to be sick again and holding on for tomorrow.
For the next year, though, Blur were a band becalmed. Debut album Leisure received a muted critical response. A grueling, drunken US tour left them with a lasting mistrust of the States. A fabulous single, Pop Scene, stalled at 35. As they began work on their second album, all were aware that it was a make-or-break period for the band.
So subsequently, after the first album came out, although it got quite good reviews at the time, I think Food were quite keen for them to broaden their horizons and look towards another producer. They tried working with Andy Partridge from XTC on the second album.
The first album did really well. I think it went gold here, and it got off to a very promising start in America. And then he recorded the second album, which really didn't have any singles on it. And I have big meetings with him saying, look guys, this has got to write a single. And we had a few arguments leading up to that about producers and things. Dave suggested Andy Partridge and then got into the studio with him, and I'd been not keen on him. But then I'd heard what he'd done and thought it was fatally flawed, but it could be fixed and could be great. And by the time I'd come to that position, they decided Andy Partridge was totally wrong.
I was in the West End seeing the Cranberries play a gig. I had just literally finished making their first album, and Graham was in the audience. I could tell things were playing in his mind. They'd obviously been through the mill trying to get this session together for the second album. I just kind of said, well, keep your chin up, and it's going to work out. I think you're a great band, and just do your best. And I really wanted to wish them well. I think the following day I got a phone call from Damon in the studio saying, Stephen, do you fancy doing a session? I was like, of course I do. I'd love to do something. And that was it. We went in the studio, I think against Dave Bows's wishes, to start doing some tracks towards Modern Life is Rubbish.
Andy was always the guy, take him off to the pub and buy him a drink and let him cry in the show.
It was good cop, bad cop.
Yeah. But it wasn't to pretend I was the bad cop and he was a good cop. But I would always be the guy who would be challenging the band and saying this isn't good enough. And Andy'd be the guy who'd say, be nice to have a single. They go, nah. And he'd go, all right then. And I'd be the guy that dig in for 3 months of warfare on an issue. It was mainly between Damon and I. I mean, Damon was very much the leader of the band, and we were always friends. We could always go out for a drink, but it eventually resulted in, oh God, if you insist, I'll go off. And he went off, I think it was one Christmas time, and came back with For Tomorrow, which I loved. And it was totally Ray Davies meets David Bowie, two of my favourites, and it was just a great single. In a perfect world, if we hadn't had the months of nasty arguments, I would have said, do us another like that. But I thought, well, I'll count the blessings that I eventually got this, and we'll put it in. So we recorded that, and it was great. Everybody was happy. We're going to. The big cheeses from America flew over and said, "It's a great album, guys. Love For Tomorrow. We need one more. Please give us one more." And the whole thing started up again. And I had to agree with them. I mean, I'd given up the fight, but I did agree with the Americans. I thought they needed another single. But again, eventually, they gave in and went away and wrote a song. And Damon can always write a hit when he wants to. And he did, and he wrote Chemical World. And so they had two strong singles on that album. For Tomorrow and Chemical World still made it a commercially disappointing album, but it made it artistically and critically very acclaimed, and it set them up perfectly for the resurgence of Britpop.
The mood was a bit of a slap in the face, but looking back on it, I think also at the same time David was right. We were lacking one or two tracks to make it a really good album, and I'll give him credit for that, because he actually gave Damon the kick up the rear end that perhaps was needed just to get those final two songs out of him. We took a break over Christmas, and in that time I think Damon wrote For Tomorrow and what became Chemical World as well. And we reconvened I think in the first week of January the following year, went in the studio to do For Tomorrow, and it became apparent very quickly that this was a killer track, and it had to be the first single from that album.
In America, Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit and the birth of grunge had stymied Blur. At home, there was worse to come. While Blur had been recording and touring exhaustingly at home and abroad, a new band had stolen much of Blur's swagger and thunder. It was a situation given added piquancy by the fact that Damon Albarn's new girlfriend had once been a member and lover of these new rivals from Sussex.
When Modern Life came out, really it was in the shadow of what Suede had achieved, I think, the previous months. And so really, while the press were kind of very keen to give Suede lots of kind of coverage, Blur really didn't feature quite so highly. They were perceived as being this kind of slightly ex-baggy band, as it were, that didn't quite fit the scene anymore. I think the thing about Modern Life is Rubbish is that if anyone listens to it, they can tell there is something quite sharp there, very British, as the Smiths were very British too. And it just got enough key people interested to give them a second chance, I believe.
It kept them in the game, that album, with those two singles, and I don't think they'd have been even in the game without those two singles. And I don't think they disagree with that.
Modern Life is Rubbish was named after graffiti on the Bayswater Road in London. Significantly, they had considered but rejected British Image and England versus America as titles. It caught the ear of smarter journalists and punters, heralding a new sound steeped in classic British pop traditions, but commercially it was less impressive. There was still a worrying shadow over the band's future.
Sunday, here again, a walk in the park. you meet an old soldier and talk of the past. He brought the lads into a war, singing and he knew his animal. He sings the songs of praise every week, but always falls asleep. For the someday sleep, but he knows what he knows.
It had been a tough time for Blur. Poor accounting practice from their first manager had brought them to the brink of bankruptcy. Their relationship with Dave Balfe had all but ended. They were drinking and brawling constantly, a lifestyle that contributed to a famously anarchic and incompetent show at the London Astoria, supporting, of all bands, the high-flying Suede. New manager Chris Morrison read them the riot act. They either shaped up or shipped out. EMI were on the verge of dropping them from the label. There was but one light in the gloom though. They were making some of the best music of their short life.
Confidence is a preference for the habitual voyeur of what is known as. A morning suit can be avoided if you take a route straight through what is known as. John's got brewer's fruit, he gets intimidated by the dirty pigeons. They love a bit of it. Who's that gut lord marching? You should cut down on your pork life, mate. Get some exercise.
All the people, so many people, they all go hand in hand through their life. You know what I mean?
Damon was on a roll. While they were touring the Modern Life is Rubbish album, there was a few songs that were kind of coming into the set which finally appeared on the next album. At that time I think it was so prolific. They were always constantly in the studio demoing songs for Food and EMI to listen to, and when those songs were given the okay by Food, I was then asked to go in the studio and record master versions of them. Not particularly because Food wanted to, but because the band wanted to, and they were keen to kind of keep the relationship going.
Damon was doing the voice originally. We wanted to get Phil Daniels to tell a story over the debt collector. So I think we just wanted him on the record. Like, where can we put him? Oh, we can do Parklife. Be great.
Confidence is a preference for the habitual voyeur of what is known as. A morning suit can be avoided if you take a route straight through what is known as. John's got brewer's fruit, he gets intimidated by the dirty pigeons. They love a bit of it. Who's that gut lord marching? You should cut down on your pork life, mate. Get some exercise.
All the people, so many people, they all go hand in hand through their life.
I remember having conversations about the actual song, and I said to Damon, you've got this absolutely best pop chorus in the history of the world ever, and you've got this verse, and can't we do something about it? So, and that was the extent. I'd make this kind of mild comment now, and it wouldn't be received well, and I think fair enough, leave it to it. And I was just disillusioned with the whole thing. As I said, I felt that I didn't want to do things if that was going to be my relationship with them, and I wanted to go off and do something that was more my own thing, and decided to pack it in.
Six Music's Artist Collection. Blur.
In the first week of March 1994, Blur released their 8th single. It proved to be the most important release of their career. A catchy, clever slice of retro disco about the hedonism of the British on holiday, and it made them into global superstars.
was when we fully developed the yin and yang that is Coxon and James, where our kind of contrariness to each other musically, there's nothing at all personal. Actually, it's one of Blur's strengths, I think, that he was doing his funk, and I was contrary to his funk. He was wanting to be in Jan Jan, I was wanting to be in Gang of Four, and it does sound a bit like Gang of Four.
I should be someone you really love. Avoiding all work, 'cause there's none available. Like battery thinkers, count your thoughts on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers. Nothing is wasted, only reproduce. You get nasty blisters, do session, but we haven't been introduced. Girls who are boys, who like boys, who be girls, who do boys like their girls, who do girls like their boys. Always should be someone you really love.
It was a kind of marketing man's dream, really, because it kind of hit all the groups that record companies are looking to appeal to. Food Records have been trying to get us to put that drum beat on everything we did.
I was going, look guys, you write a song with a dance beat on it, it's a big hit. Write another song with a dance beat on it, and when Girls and Boys eventually came around, I said, that's what I was talking about.
If we do something that seems quite new to us, I think we're very unsure a lot of times actually what we've created.
But those kind of tracks, it's odd because you can just listen to them like music rather than have to get completely emotionally entangled in them and never be able to hear them properly. So all there is a couple of cymbals on there from me, but I can hear it like a non-member of Blur. It's cool not being on your record.
Girls who are boys, who like boys, who be girls, who do boys like their girls, who do girls like their boys. Always should be someone to really love.
Weren't you in the shouty bit?
I was, yeah, I suppose I am actually. I'm on it more than I think actually, aren't I? There's some cymbals and some shouting. That's probably my vocal debut though, probably.
Looking for girls who are boys, who like boys, to be girls who do boys like their girls, who do girls like their boys. Always should be someone you really love. Girls who are boys, who like boys, to be girls who do boys like their girls, who do girls like their boys. Always should be someone you really love.
Well, it was funny, when we were doing the Parklife session, at the time, the band would have to do demos of the songs they were writing, and then for approval from EMI and Food to then go off and record. And we were on a session working, I think it was the second session for the album, and Damon played me a demo of Girls and Boys that he'd just done. And I loved it straight away. And I just said, look, this is fantastic. You know, this has got to be a single. Let's do it now. And it was so obvious that really what we had to do, it needed that real COD kind of 120 BPM disco feel for it to really kind of get that vibe. Because at the time, the baggy thing, everything was a bit slower. Or it was the faster house stuff, you know? So I programmed up the drum machine, very basic beat. Alex started playing his bass line over the programmed bass line that we put down. And it just started coming together really quickly, and everyone was buzzing. And we honestly, I swear, we put the major parts of that track together in one day. And that night, or the following day, I got a phone call from Andy Ross at Food, and you can say, how's it going? So it's going great, Andy. Listen, we've got this great new song called Girls and Boys that we've just been recording. It's awesome. And it was like, well, Stephen, we haven't really asked you to do that one. You know, we booked you to do these other songs. I said, well, Andy, please, when you hear it, you're going to love it. Well, the rest is history. He came down and he did like it. I always remember saying to Damon as he did his vocal on it, and we finished, I said, I swear that's going to be your first top 5 single. And thank God. I think I was proved right.
Girls and Boys was one of a handful of huge hits on an album called Parklife. It was not just Blur's most successful album to date, it also helped define an era. It changed the way Britain dressed and spoke, changed the British film industry, football culture, and arguably the face of British politics. Not bad for a pop album by a band on the verge of collapse.
She says there's ants in the carpet, dirty little monsters, eating all the muscles, picking up the rubbish. Give her effervescence, she needs a little sparkle. Good morning TV, you're looking so healthy. We all say don't want to be alone. We wear the same clothes, cause we feel the same. And kiss the dry lips when we say goodnight. Another century, oh, it's nothing special.
We linked football with pop music very directly, and I think that was probably the beginning of Britpop. A lot of people will sort of claim to start it, but that's where it all got out of hand.
We were still a struggling indie band in danger of being dropped when we made that. And we put everything into
exactly. Modern Life is Rubbish sold 15,000 records in Britain, and Parklife sold, I don't know, 1.7 million or whatever, and was followed on by a lot of records that sold even more. A platinum record had been an enormous achievement. Gold record was like, you've got a career, but this one took it out of there, and then it's just gone on. You've had Oasis and then Travis, and I mean, I wonder how far it can go. It's just the audience has got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
And that record really did change what mainstream pop sounded like.
Because of the reaction live to that song, it's always been a really great moment in any gig for me. We have in an obtuse way, charted a lot of trends in Britain over the 90s through those singles, and you know, a lot of them you could take as classic examples of a period.
When they're doing the rock years, the 90s, playing the representative song from each year, I mean, they're going to quiz it.
Parklife is dotted with fabulous moments, but perhaps the greatest is This Is a Low, a brooding, dreamlike journey into the British landscape and psyche, inspired by a late-night broadcasting institution.
There are warnings of gales in Viking, North Utsira, South Utsira, Rockall, Hebrides, Faroes and Southeast Iceland.
We recorded earlier on the session This Is a Low, and Damon had kind of a bit of a problem getting the lyrics finished for it. We basically kind of got to the point we'd finished and mixed nearly all the other tracks, and there's this one backing track left. And I think he was kind of prepared to say, we've got enough tracks to the album now, we'll leave it. And I was saying, no, please, finish it off. And the other guy said the same thing too, it's worth, finishing. And he came back in the following day with a lyric, and we mixed it that same day.
To this day, probably got one of my best lyrics ever, even if I did nick it off the handkerchief. The shipping forecast is something I've listened to since a child, and when I was younger, you always used to send me to sleep, so I've travelled around that metaphoric route.
I just thought, well, we've got enough good tracks on this album now to kind of keep the ball rolling. And the record company I thought were very good. I think they chose the releases from the album pretty well. The guys were just loved by all the media. If they can appeal to the girls as well as appealing to all the kind of journalists and everything, I think you've got everything really, really sussed. And then Oasis were bursting through on the scene at the time, as were Pulp. And there just seemed to be a buzz of like, there's something happening. There's some interesting bands coming through with something to say that is making the scene. It was just an extremely exciting time. And everywhere you look, there'll be a Billboard cover or something with either Liam or Damon or Jarvis. Previously, when I was working with the Smiths, I mean, the only people achieving platinum status and so on in those days were the Phil Collinses and the Tina Turners of this world. Yeah. And if you got a gold record, that was great. That was an achievement. But now it was like Pulp and Oasis and Blur, and everyone was getting platinum records. It was fantastic. You really felt like you were part of something.
As Britpop was trumpeted from every tabloid and Blur entered their high imperial phase, one man inextricably linked with their story was about to leave the stage though. Dave Valve had had enough.
All those dirty words, they make us look so dumb. Been drinking far too much.
Before the album was completed, I was just, for various reasons, because Jesus Jones's follow-up album had been, one that sold 2 million, the next one sold 400,000. And I was just disillusioned with the whole thing. As I said, I felt that I didn't want to do things if that was going to be my relationship with them, and I wanted to go off and do something that was more my own thing. And decided to pack it in and flog. But the weird thing about selling a label is you have to spend 3 or 4 months negotiating the sale, at the same time of which nobody can know about it, even your secretary, because she'll tell everybody. And you've got to carry on as normal, because the sale might not happen, the deal might not be agreed, and you don't want everybody thinking they're in limbo and everything falling to pot while you do it. So it's very weird, and then when you've done it. You've literally signed off, and you've got to wander up, and we turned up at a meeting they were having in a nearby cafe and said, by the way guys, I've just sold the label, hope you don't mind, Andy's going to be carrying on working with you. And that was that, and they kind of all were very friendly, very nice. I mean, we're still friends, we still hug each other when we see each other. But, and I am still astonished at the depth of pain I cause them whenever I read about it. And I'm astonished at the evil bastard I've been described as. But undoubtedly, I deserve some of that, but it was never intentional.
Infatuated only with ourselves, and neither of us can think straight anymore. Well, you and I collapse
I believe that the third album for bands is a very important album. Bands like XTC and The Jam and The Clash, they all made great third albums, and that's when you really come of age. I believe that's what happened with Parklife. The band really came of age. They really suddenly found what they were truly about.
And so we leave Blur, enjoying for the moment their newfound fame.
City dweller, successful fella, thought to himself, oops, I've got a lot of money. Caught in a rat race, terminally. I'm a professional cynic, but my heart's not in it. I'm paying the price of living life at the limit. Caught up in the centuries, anxiety. Yes, it preys on him.
Everyone was generally quite happy with the making of the record.
I thought that song was great until we put umpire on it.
My entire experience of it has been 99% flattered.
Graham would come in with these garage records and say, oh, I'd like it to sound a bit like this.
It was quite a rough little song, really.
If you've got a song that which is, say, country house, there's no way in a million years I can produce that to sound like that. You know, it's just ridiculous.
It was umpired out of existence.
I think even if it said that it was a song Balfour is the total bastard and went on for 5 minutes, if it got to number one, I'd be flattered.
If it turned into something that thuggish, thoughtless people would be into rather than anyone who liked music.
It just became this enormous albatross.
And the video did exactly the same, so I still hate it.
If you can tell an Oasis from a Blur, you should be on tenterhooks this evening. The Battle of the Bands is reaching its climax.
A couple of things were said that really did upset Damon in particular.
It's reminded some of the fierce rivalry between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones 30 years ago.
It drove Damon up the wall.
The Gallagher brothers being as they are, they can be a little bit, edgy.
I think people sometimes were a bit snobby about it with this sort of supposed north and south thing, saying they were public school boys, which they're not.
Educated the expensive way. He knows his Clara from his Beaujolais. I think he'd like to have been running cry, but then nature didn't make him that way.
It's funny because they were always pretty cool towards Graham for some reason, but they like to kind of rub up Damon the wrong way a fair bit. They had a go at Damon for his education when he went to the same school as Graham, so I didn't quite understand that.
Yeah.
6 Music's Artist Collection. Blur.
Drunk and poorly, sleeping really late. Sad, drunk and poorly, not feeling so great. Wandering lost in a town full of frowns. Sad, drunk and poorly, dogs digging up the ground. So great and I love you. Surprise,
you're so great and I love you.
Shouts and song and drinking lemonade.